The Bogosity Podcast, early and ad-free. Become a subscriber at Patreon, Subscribestar, or Discord. Use the links at donate.bogosity.tv.
Welcome to the Bogosity Podcast for the week of November 3rd, 2024. The podcast that says it wants a revolution. This is your host, Shane Killian. Let's grease-eyes the news of the bogus. Fair warning, this is the podcast before the election, so there's a lot of that coming up. But we'll do our first couple of segments about other important stories and save the election headaches for later. Starting with more idiocy on the AI front. I mean, how many times do I have to tell you that AI is not a hotline to truth? We've covered more than once where lawyers got into trouble because their LLM created fake cases. We've laughed at news organizations using AI to write copy without even editing it. But I guess it was only a matter of time before authoritarians used it to push their rules on people. In this case, it's Dina Bishop, Commissioner of the Alaska Department of Education and Early Development, who needed to draft a policy restricting cell phone use in Alaska schools. Currently, Alaska has no statewide policy on cell phone use, and it's left to the district or school level. Cue the screeching all over the state that cell phones are designed to be addictive and are basically psychological abuse. So Bishop needed to draft a statewide policy, and she needed to be able to justify it. Since she apparently didn't have anything else, she used ChatGPT, which handily made up complete studies to justify it. The AI hallucinated studies from the Journal of Education Psychology, the Cyberbullying Research Center, the Journal of Educational Psychology, the Journal of Adolescence, and Pew Research Center. While those exist, the citations are complete fantasy. Yeah, I was surprised as you that the Cyberbullying Research Center is an actual thing. The fake studies claimed that cell phone use in schools increase symptoms of anxiety and depression, enables cyberbullying, and causes significantly lower school performance. Ellie Pavlik, professor of computer science at Brown University, said, quote, "That is exactly the type of pattern that one sees with AI hallucinated citations. It's just very typical that you would see these fake citations that would have a real journal, sometimes even a real personal person, a plausible name, but not correspond to a real thing. That's just like the pattern of citations you would expect from a language model. At least, we've seen them do something like that." Your reminder that all LLMs do is pick a probable next word over and over and over again. The whole idea is for them to make stuff up as they go along. They don't have memory, they don't have data to reference, they're just making out sentences at random that seem like they make sense. And while that has its uses, this isn't one of them. Bishop later tried to claim it was just a first draft and the studies were placeholders. How do you have a placeholder for a study? Why not just put the study there? And if you don't have the study, how do you know what the data's supposed to be? And the problem is, a lot of AI-created data is apparently still in the version that the board reviewed and voted on, including a fake 2019 study from the American Psychological Association claiming, quote, "Students in schools with cell phone restrictions showed lower levels of stress and higher levels of academic achievement." Pavlik said, quote, "I think there's also a real concern, especially when people in positions of authority use this, because this kind of degrading of trust that's already there, right? Once it comes out a few times that information is fake, whether intentionally or not, then it becomes easy to dismiss anything as fake." Which is probably a good mental heuristic. If an authoritarian makes a claim, instantly doubt it. Seriously, how can it not be willful at this point? They all should know how AI works. They all should know better. And if they don't, what business do they have educating our kids?
Sometimes you just have to stomp some skulls. From the mind of Mr. Dapperton, a game for the ages. In a world where a race of undead furries tries to take over the world's nuclear arsenal, one man must stop them. But which man? You choose. Dapperton. Elon.
Not my Dogecoins.
Joe.
Build me back.
Shapiro.
My kippa's ruined.
Or Don John.
Ow, my ear!
Forget those losers. You know you want to play as me, Lord Killian. That's right. You can stomp the skulls of those commie furries and save the universe as me.
7 complete different worlds with more coming all the time. Full controller support. You can even get eaten by a worm and pooped out into a furry cathedral. You know you want this game. Go to links.bogosity.tv/skullstompers and play Skull Stompers now.
And some good news on an issue we've been following. How much can government spy on your phone usage without a warrant? 6 years ago, the Supreme Court found that warrants are required before law enforcement can obtain cell site location information. In the past, third-party records weren't considered for Fourth Amendment protection because that only applies to government. So law enforcement would have to get AT&T to hand it over, which, unfortunately, they do with glee. But in the Carpenter decision, the Supremes found that cell site records were a different beast, since someone's location is personal information, not third party. The fact that it's collected and held by a third party doesn't negate Fourth Amendment protection. Well, now, this case is about so-called ping warrants, where government demands information that doesn't exist yet. Ordinarily, warrants can only allow law enforcement to get information that already exists. They can't demand that information be collected or generated. But a ping refers to a signal actively sent by the cell service provider at the behest of law enforcement. That allows them to determine the location of the person's phone. They combine that with pin register/trap and trace orders, normally used to get information about what numbers phone calls were made to or received from. Since that's historical third-party data, Carpenter doesn't apply. Even though this historical data doesn't exist yet, is collected in real time, and likely wouldn't ever have been stored or even collected in the first place without the law enforcement request. So a federal court in New Mexico found that you can't get around the warrant requirement just by combining a few other techniques. Tracking the user's location is still tracking the user's location, even if you use novel techniques that courts haven't specifically prohibited. The court found, 1. The SCA does not, on its own, permit the government to obtain prospective location information, but that, 2. The SCA in combination with the pin/trap statute does permit such prospective information. This combination, 3, renders the cell phone a tracking device subject to the TDS and procedural requirements for tracking devices under Rule 41. They were very clear that cell phones were tracking devices, and you can't use them to track a person without a warrant, regardless of the specific procedure you went through to do so. Quote, if these statutes operate in conjunction, the cell phone for which records are obtained becomes a tracking device subject to the notice provision. Because a cell phone becomes a tracking device and the pin/trap statute requires an installation, the jurisdictional provision of the TDS applies, and the government will need to establish probable cause that the phone will be in the District of New Mexico when the installation occurs, i.e., when traffic begins. Moreover, you can't make someone create information that you're then using. Government cannot force third parties to generate information solely for use in a criminal case. They can't claim there's probable cause to believe that a service provider has these records, since the records don't even exist until the company starts tracking the phone in compliance with the law enforcement request. It's almost certain the government will appeal this, and hopefully higher courts will see it the right way too. Of course, in the past, they've proven to be even more unreliable than cell phone location tracking. If you're on the Wi-Fi in a coffee shop or hotel, anyone on that network can get your traffic. Do you really trust all of those strangers? For that matter, do you really trust your ISP? A VPN can protect you from prying eyes, disguise your location, and even foil government censors. It's essential in this day and age, so go to vpn.pagosity.tv and you'll be taken to BoxPN. Starting at just $2.99 a month, you can get unlimited high-speed connections to VPN servers all over the world, and they don't log connections, so your privacy is assured. Traveling abroad, just VPN home, and don't worry about what those other governments are doing. Back at home, stop your ISP from traffic shaping and messing with the quality internet access you're paying good money for. You can connect from multiple machines at once, including your smartphone or tablet, and it supports all the secure standards, including OpenVPN and SSTP. Bypass censors and surveillance with your own secure VPN connection. Go to vpn.pagosity.tv. Okay, we're doing election stuff now, so brace yourselves, and this one is about a bunch of shenanigans going on in Michigan, and the big question will be, can I stuff all of this into one segment? One big problem is, as we've repeatedly covered, the voting machines, and in particular, this is about the Dominion Voter Assist Terminals, or VATs, a machine that people with disabilities or anyone else can use to mark their ballots. It then prints your ballot for you, and then puts it in the tabulator. There's a bug, though. Michigan is a straight party state, meaning that of all the state-approved parties, you just press a button or fill in an oval and vote for every single candidate for that party in one go. If you decide you want some exceptions to that, you can just vote for specific candidates, and that overrides it. So, for example, if you vote straight Republican, but then fill in the oval for Chase Oliver for president, it'll cast your vote for every Republican on the ballot except Donald Trump, casting the one for Oliver instead. But these VATs have an issue. If you select a straight party ticket, it will not let you make exceptions like it's supposed to. If you try it, you'll get an error message. You can still vote the way you want, but you'd have to unmark the straight ticket and select each candidate individually. Here's what Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson said in response to a reporter's question about it.
It's been noted that there's been issues with the programming of the VATs with specifically from Dominion. Mm-hmm. Why was that only caught in the past few days, and why can't it be fixed? I saw the release.
Yeah, this is a nationwide issue with Dominion voter access terminals in...
Wait, nationwide? This is everywhere, and it's just you guys who are only noticing this now?
In the counties that use them, and the voter access terminals, of course, not all the machines, just the ones that are accessible, have an issue with the straight party voting.
So it doesn't prevent you from voting a certain way, it just makes it more difficult. That is, more difficult for disabled people. The exact people this thing is supposed to make it easier for. And it gets worse. In Michigan, as well as other states such as Pennsylvania, there's a lot of confusion, much of it deliberately caused, making non-citizen residents think they can vote when only citizens can cast a valid ballot. In this case, it's a Chinese student from the University of Michigan who early voted on Sunday in Ann Arbor. The student is now charged with perjury and attempting to cast an illegal vote. An attempt which succeeded, by the way. He was legally in the U.S., but was just a resident, not a citizen. Nevertheless, he was able to register to vote, cast a ballot, and use his UM student ID to verify himself. His ballot was entered into a tabulator at the university site. Later on, the student contacted the local clerk's office asking if he could somehow get his ballot back. None of the news stories say, but it seems apparent that this guy thought he could vote legally, and then, when he realized he couldn't, called up voluntarily and tried to rectify things. And that's when he was arrested. Prosecutor Eli Savitz said, quote, "We are grateful for the swift action of the clerk in this case, who took the appropriate steps and referred the case to law enforcement. We are also grateful to law enforcement for swiftly and thoroughly investigating this case. Anyone who attempts to vote illegally faces significant consequences, including but not limited to arrest and prosecution." City Administrator Milton Mahoney Jr. said, quote, "Through a series of actions, The student was apparently able to register, receive a ballot, and cast a vote. Based upon the scenario that we're hearing this morning, the student was fully aware of what he was doing and that it was not legal. But it sounds like he only realized it later and then called you guys to try and put things right. But the big question is, how was he able to make it that far in the first place? His illegal vote is going to count, and there's no way to take it back. Once the ballot is put through the tabulator, there's no way to undo it since, by design, there's no information matching the ballot to the voter. Sarah Hubbard, former chair of the UN Board of Regents, said, quote, "It's incredible that someone has to prove their citizenship to get on a plane or get a job in this country, but you can still vote just based on your word and sign a waiver. Now the vote is going to count and can't be rescinded. That's a mismatch." Benson's office actually used this as a bragging point. Quote, "Let this much be clear. Voting records are public. Any non-citizen who attempts to vote fraudulently in Michigan will be exposing themselves to great risk and will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." And Attorney General Dana Nessel said, quote, "It is the responsibility of each and every resident of this state and nation to adhere to the law, and Michigan election law makes clear that non-citizens cannot vote in our elections. We take all allegations of voter fraud extremely seriously, and the public should expect nothing less." But if the only way they know about it is because he outed himself, because he realized he made a mistake and then called them, how do we know how many others there are? They're making it seem like they're on top of things when, for all we know, if he hadn't called, they might never have figured it out. Benson's office said, quote, "Only U.S. citizens are able to register to vote or cast a ballot in any state or federal election. There is no evidence to support claims that large numbers of non-citizens have voted in past elections or are registering to vote in 2024. Well, we know of one. Can you even know about others? Can any of the others be counted on to call involuntarily as this student did? Especially since the message seems to be, whatever you do, don't tell us or you'll be arrested. Is it just me or does this scream scapegoat? This sounds like the case they prosecute to wave in front of everyone and say, "See, we got them all." But again, how can they know? We know it's happening, but what evidence do we have of them catching anyone who didn't out themselves first? Someone needs to keep a seriously close eye on Michigan. And now it's time to misemphasize this week's biggest bogon emitter. Well, if you're wondering how Jocelyn Benson avoided it in the last segment, it's because Colorado Secretary of State Jena Griswold is even worse. By the way, if these names are familiar, they both were involved in illegally trying to remove Donald Trump's name from the ballot in their respective states. Keep that in mind. Let's start with a massive voter fraud scheme in Mesa County. DA Dan Rubenstein has launched an investigation into ballots that were stolen from registered voters in the mail just a few weeks after Mesa County Clerk Tina Peters was sentenced to 9 years for breaching county voting equipment. According to Griswold's office, these ballots were stolen before being delivered to the mailing addresses. They were then submitted fraudulently. 3 successfully went through the system and were irrevocably counted as legitimate votes. Another 9 were stopped, so it's being downplayed as being just a dozen fraudulent ballots. But like in the last story, that's a dozen that they know of. Despite the fact that the automated signature matching system flagged them, an election judge reviewed and approved each of them. By the way, Mesa County is a very red county and went something like 2/3 for Trump in 2020. Griswold said, quote, "Every voter impacted by the scheme that we are uncovering will have the opportunity to make a voice in the 2024 general election, and affected voters will be given a new ballot. Voter fraud, voter intimidation, and voter harassment are illegal in the state of Colorado. But they, like all other Colorado voters, are going to have the power of their votes diluted by these fraudulent votes." Quote, "The system did work. It's unfortunate that 3 ballots got through, but overall this was addressed by the Mesa County clerk and a criminal investigation is underway. I like how politicians take an example of the system failing as it did here and say it's the system working. At least Mesa County Clerk Bobby Gross seems to be cognizant of the fact that this might not be all there is to it. She chided Griswold's office for her statement, quote, "While we understand the Secretary of State's desire to make public statements, this is our community and our investigation. It is critical that we follow proper procedures to ensure a thorough and effective investigation without tipping off those involved." So we know that there are fraudulent actors that are still out there, and we know there was at least one judge involved. How many more are there? More importantly, how did they get the ballots before they were mailed? Unless there's someone at the post office involved as well, this fraud could only have come out of the Secretary of State's office, which makes it even more incorrigible what happened next. Griswold's office posted an Excel spreadsheet of Colorado voting systems to their website. If you right-clicked on one of the tabs and clicked Unhide, there was at least one tab hidden, and it was full of plain text passwords. That alone will be inexcusable, but these were BIOS passwords of the voting machines. That's the basic input-output system, the part of your system that starts up initially so it can boot your operating system. And if you can get into the BIOS, you can get access to everything. And these were passwords for machines in 63 of Colorado's 64 counties. BIOS passwords are as privileged as it gets. You can do anything you want. Slip in your own rootkit. Make yourself administrator. Add anything you want to the startup sequence. Even put in your own OS and give yourself root access to everything in the system. Or even add hardware like a Wi-Fi interface to break the air gap they rely on. Again, Griswold's office tried to downplay this. Her spokesman, Jack Todd, said, quote, "This does not pose an immediate security threat to Colorado's elections, nor will it impact how ballots are counted. There are 2 unique passwords for every election equipment component, which are kept in separate places and held by different parties. Passwords can only be used with physical in-person access to a voting system." But if they're this careless with something as important as the BIOS passwords, what about the rest? Someone check under the keyboards for Post-its. The spreadsheet had been up for months before being taken down when the Colorado Republican Party blew the whistle on it. State Party Chair Dave Williams said, quote, "This demonstrates a major lapse in basic system security and password management. It's shocking, really. At best, even if the passwords were outdated, it represents significant incompetence and negligence, and it raises huge questions about password management and other basic security protocols at the highest levels within Griswold's office." Listen to this guy. He knows what he's talking about. You can harp all you want about how 2 passwords are needed, but that's no excuse for putting some of them in a public spreadsheet in plain text. And really, those passwords being public meant that, in reality, only one password was actually protecting the system. So anyone who had lawful access to everything else, but needed to be prevented from accessing the BIOS, now any of those who are bad actors can now unlawfully access everything. Kyle Clark of ABC 9 News interviewed Griswold. In that interview, she said,
"This is not the full password to access voting equipment."
"But it is! It's the BIOS password! It gets you root access to the entire system!"
Is it accurate that you did not notify the county clerks of this breach and they found out when the Colorado Republican Party announced it today?
What is accurate is that we had began an investigation and we're working with the appropriate federal partners.
Had you announced it to the county clerks?
No, we had not. We were doing an investigation and in the field actually today before it was announced by the Republican Party.
Did the actions of your office pose an insider threat to elections?
No.
And why do you say that?
For several reasons. First off, I do want to underline, given the atmosphere around this election, that this does not pose an immediate security threat to Colorado's elections.
Folks, go look at this part of the interview and just look at how mad she is. She is seriously wincing mad that she's being held to the fire by this reporter, and she just gets madder.
In 2021, when Mesa County's voting system passwords leaked, your office said, quote, "The public disclosure of the BIOS passwords for one or more components of Mesa County's voting system alone constitutes a serious breach of voting system security protocols." By that standard, did your office commit a serious breach of voting system security protocols?
No. There's several things. First off, the situation in Mesa County is very distinct to the situation that we are facing today.
In other words, this time is different.
We were actively investigating the password disclosure as part of a bigger security breach in Mesa County.
Pardon me. What your office said was that the public disclosure of the BIOS passwords alone constituted a serious breach of voting system security. So now that your office has leaked passwords, does that also constitute a serious breach of voting system security protocols?
Well, to push back on you, Kyle, that sentence is in the press release, but there is a much bigger press release.
What have you done to determine whether those passwords have been used by an authorized person in the months that your office had them online?
Well, we started an investigation immediately after discovering that some of the passwords were online.
And she just continued on, not answering the question.
So after the Mesa County passwords leaked in 2021, you said that your team couldn't confirm that the BIOS passwords hadn't been used at some point to alter the setting of the machines. That's why, among other reasons, you ordered that the county stop using them. Why no similar order here prior to your investigation of whether these machines were illegally entered?
So what is your question? I'm sorry, Kyle.
The question is, in 2021, you ordered Mesa County to stop using the machines for which passwords were leaked because you said your team could not confirm whether the machines had been illegally accessed. Given that your team has not yet completed the assessment of whether any machines in Colorado have been illegally accessed, why are they still being used?
So there's two different situations. In Mesa County, we knew that both passwords to access the voting equipment were used. We knew that someone did get onto the voting equipment. And again, our security posture is much different than it was in 2021 when all this was occurring. We have no reason to believe that a Mesa County situation is happening. We don't have we have no evidence for that.
You don't wait for evidence. You just do it. Security is proactive, not reactive. Sorry if I'm playing a lot and making this segment longer, but you really need to hear this woman, and kudos to Kyle Clark for being an awesome journalist and holding her feet to the fire.
In 2021, you directed the Colorado Department of State to investigate the password leak in Mesa County. Who will investigate the password leak from your office?
Well, we're disclosing what happened, and again, Kyle, this is not the same situation as Mesa County.
See what I mean? She doesn't have an answer for any of this. And as Clark pointed out to her, the only people who are investigating the actions of her office are her office.
Given your office's repeated errors that have damaged confidence in our elections, which you say is paramount, will you resign?
Dang! Go for the jugular, Kyle!
Absolutely not, Kyle. And I just want to, you're unfairly characterizing and leaving out some crucial information. And to push back even further, Kyle, Colorado is tied for number one in confidence in the country in our elections. We have stood up to situations time and time again to protect the right of Coloradans.
No, you didn't, Jenna. You illegally tried to get opponents taken off the ballot. You demanded that other people get charged and even sent to jail for 9 years and lectured everyone about safe and secure elections while your own office is leaking BIOS passwords and now sending people all over the place to change passwords with no indication of what else they might do to those machines, with no opportunity to recertify the machines before the election. And then come back and promise that everything is safe and secure, when we know they weren't even going to tell us about this breach.
Given the number of fundamental errors that your office has made that have undermined voter confidence in elections, why do you think they keep happening?
Why do errors happen? Kyle, there are unfortunately situations that arise every election that we are fixing as quickly as possible.
These errors don't just happen, Jenna. They are gross incompetence at best, election interference at worst. Just listen to this entire interview. Listen to him ask directly if she was ever going to tell the public about this, and listen to her call it a gotcha premise. He repeatedly asked if they would have told the public, and she kept not answering the question. And gone was the smug perkiness of her friendly interviews when she was throwing Trump off the ballot, replaced by a stern, sneering fury at actually having to answer for her office for once. I won't pester you with updates. This segment has gone on long enough. Just know that she put rules in place to address this. Yes, bureaucrats can screw up, then create rules to give them new powers to fix the system they screwed up to begin with. New powers that will still be around after Election Day. How do you like that? Well, after all of that, who else but Jenna Griswold could be this week's biggest bogon emitter? I want to tell you about the eyeglasses I've been wearing for years. As people can see on my videos, I have a very strong prescription, which makes glasses more expensive, especially when I need computer glasses, reading glasses, prescription sunglasses, and most expensively, progressive lenses for general everyday wear. To save money while still getting quality glasses, I get them from Firmoo. In fact, I just got a pair of progressives with high-index aspherical lenses and a nice pair of frames my wife loves for just over $100. It would have been $500 to get them through my eye doctor. Not only do they look good, the glasses are durable. I've worn many pairs for several years without problems. All orders come with a 30-day return policy, a 3-month warranty, and one-on-one customer service. Go to Firmoo, that's FIRMOO.Bogosity.tv anytime you need quality glasses at a low price. Once again, that's Firmoo.Bogosity.tv. Oh, after that, it's nice to have a rare treat. We have another recipient for the Silver Kluon Award from a very unlikely person. Mark Zuckerberg. One thing Meta has done right is in making their Llama AI large language model open source so it can be used by the world. Unlike some other companies I could mention that have open in their name. But the beauty is how he laid out the case for open source so perfectly. It means that other people, quote, make improvements and then they publish it. And it's very easy for us to then incorporate that both back into Llama and in our Meta products like Meta AI or AI Studio or Business AI. We found counterintuitively with Open Compute that by publishing and sharing the architectures and designs that we had for our compute, the industry standardized around it a bit more. We got some suggestions also that helped us save costs, and that just ended up being really valuable for us. As Llama gets adopted more, you're seeing folks like NVIDIA and AMD optimize their chips more to run Llama specifically well, which clearly benefits us. So it benefits everyone who's using Llama, but it makes our products better rather than if we were just on an island. I think it's good business for us to do this in an open way. Because they, along with the rest of us, also reap the benefits of what the community at large is doing with the model. So beautiful and so perfect. So thanks, Zuck. Enjoy your shiny new Silver Kluon. It's just a shame it's coming to you in a black box. Do you have children, or nieces or nephews? Are you homeschooling, or just want to counter some of the socialist indoctrination most children get in school? If so, go to Bogosity.tv/TuttleTwins, and you'll be taken to a website where you can get some great books for elementary-aged children. The Tuttle Twins books are books about liberty and free market economics that include children's versions of Bastiat's The Law, Leonard Read's I, Pencil, and Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, as well as books about the Federal Reserve and how regulations protect business cronies. They'll learn about the harm caused by eminent domain, or regulations passed in the name of safety, and fundamental concepts of liberty. And as you can see from the sample pages on the website, they're all easy to read and nicely illustrated. They're just $9.99 a piece, or get a special discount as well as free bonuses when you purchase all 5. You can even buy in bulk to donate to schools and local libraries. So get the Tuttle Twins books at bogosity.tv/Tuttle Twins. And now let's disincorporate this week's Idiot Extraordinaire. And this week it goes to Jimmy Kimmel for making a joke which, according to legal precedent, he should be jailed for. What kind of joke should you be jailed for, you ask? Well, no kind, but that's not what's happened before. But before we get into it, let's hear Kimmel.
If you can vote early, vote early. If you can't vote early, vote on time. If you want to vote for Trump, vote late, vote very late. Do your voting on Thursday or maybe Friday.
Does that sound familiar to you? Do you feel like maybe you've heard that before? Yeah, not only is the joke not original, it's the joke that the Biden-Harris administration and Attorney General Merrick Garland believe is illegal and worthy of prosecution and 10 years in prison. At least when it's done by the other guys. That's how Douglas Mackey was imprisoned in 2016 when he tweeted that Hillary voters should vote from home, which is impossible, or wait until Wednesday to vote, which is too late. 6 days after Biden took office, Mackey was arrested. Incredibly, he was found guilty and sentenced to 7 months, 2 years supervised release, and a $15,000 fine. Mackey said, quote, Charles Clymer sent out his text to thousands of actual voters. Jimmy Kimmel told his joke to an audience of millions. The joke meme I sent out didn't even reach more than 100 people until BuzzFeed and Wired reported on it. Clymer was the trans activist who sent out texts telling voters that they had already voted when they hadn't. You also had Christina Wong posting that Trump supporters skipped the polls and text their vote, which is impossible. She wasn't prosecuted. Only in Mackey's case was it called election interference, and despite numerous Supreme Court precedents, including Brandenburg and Sullivan, the Biden administration thinks they get to prosecute that. And they got their corrupt judge to go along with it. Mackey's sentence was stayed and he filed an appeal with the Second Circuit, which is still pending 8 years later. Justice delayed is justice denied. So, what does it say about Kimmel that he's making this joke openly to 1.7 million people? He probably thinks he's safe being all buddy-buddy to the Biden administration, but what if Trump wins? Under the Mackey president, he could be prosecuted and threatened with up to 10 years in prison. And if Trump is even 1% of the fascist Kimmel claims he is, he wouldn't hesitate to do it. I mean, aren't they all fear-mongering that Trump is going to imprison his political enemies? Or does he actually think that Trump won't do anything about it? But then, that would undermine the entire basis for all of the monologues he's done this week, including the one that was, quote, a special monologue for the Republican in your life. Because it means he actually believes that Trump will be less of a fascist than Biden. So all of that makes Jimmy Kimmel this week's Idiot Extraordinaire. Well, that wraps up this hairy-legged Highlander edition of the Bogosity Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please go to donate.bogosity.tv for several ways to support, and discord.bogosity.tv to join the discussion. Subscribe at the Discord or at Patreon or Subscribestar, and you can listen early and ad-free. Thank you for listening. Until next time, here's a quote from Alexei de Tocqueville. A man's admiration for absolute government is proportional to his contempt he feels for those around him. The Bogosity Podcast is licensed under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License.
Bogosity.